Welcome to Meteorology Matters. Today we're embarking on a really deep and sadly incredibly somber dive into a catastrophic event that just gripped the heart of Texas.
Yeah, it's been devastating.
Just days ago, the Texas Hill Country was brutally ravaged by these awful floods. The sheer suddenness, the raw ferocity of those floodwaters, it's almost impossible to grasp, and the human cost is truly heartbreaking.
It really is. As of the latest reports we have, over 100 lives have been claimed, and a chilling 171 people are still missing.
171. It's a tragedy that just serves as this powerful, stark reminder of nature's immense power, isn't it?
Absolutely. Lives changed forever or
Yep.
tragically just extinguished with shocking speed. It really forces us to look beyond the immediate devastation, and understand the layers beneath.
It truly does. And on this deep dive of the Meteorology Matters podcast, our mission really, it extends far beyond just talking about the weather itself.
Right. The weather was the catalyst, no doubt. But the full story, it's much bigger.
Exactly. We're going to meticulously explore the complex, interwoven layers that contributed to such a devastating event. This isn't just about rain or river levels. It's profoundly about preparedness. It's about the vital lines of communication, and it's deeply rooted in the underlying societal decisions that ultimately shape how vulnerable we are to these powerful natural forces.
And our aim for you, our listener, is to help you quickly but thoroughly grasp what happened and, maybe even more importantly, why it happened without feeling completely overwhelmed by just the sheer volume of information that always surrounds a disaster like this.
Yeah, information overload is real.
It is. So we're committed to unpacking these interwoven factors, providing clear, concise insights, and sharing compelling details that truly illuminate the scale and complexity of this tragedy.
So settle in because this is an extraordinarily important conversation. It touches upon critical aspects of community, governance, human behavior, all of
Yeah.
it. Before we jump into the details, though, just a quick reminder to connect with meteorologist Rob Johns. You can find him on Instagram. His handle is meteorologist.
He's great. Follow him.
Definitely. And on TikTok, he's TV meteorologist. And make sure you subscribe to the Rob Jones Hurricane YouTube channel. That's also where you'll find the entire Meteorology Matters podcast playlist. Lots more deep dives like this one. Okay, let's begin to unpack this.
Let's do it.
Our journey into this really profound event begins right at the heart of the tragedy itself. The Texas Hill Country floods. The scale of devastation here is just grim.
It's hard to even talk about the numbers sometimes.
Yeah.
They represent real people, real families.
Exactly. They're not just statistics. As we speak, over 100 confirmed deaths have been reported. And 5 days after the flood event, a staggering 171 people are still unaccounted for. This isn't some distant event. It's recent. It's raw.
And what's particularly heartbreaking, really puts a face to these numbers, is how concentrated the casualties were in certain areas. Kerr County, it bears the heaviest burden. They reported 84 deaths there alone.
84 in one county.
And within that awful count, at least 30 children lost their lives. Many of these young victims were campers from Camp Mystic. It's a Christian summer camp right there along the Guadalupe River.
Oh, the summer camp. I heard about that. Just horrific.
It is. A specific tally actually indicates 27 campers and staff members from Camp Mystic were killed. And as of the most recent reports we have, the bodies of 5 young girls and a 19-year-old counselor still haven't been recovered.
Still missing. The agony for those families must be unbearable.
Imagine. The grief, the sheer void left behind, it just sends chills down your spine thinking about it.
It's unimaginable. That concentration of loss in one place, especially involving so many young lives and the families still waiting. And the devastation wasn't just Kerr County, right? Though it was certainly the worst hit.
No, definitely not. The flood's reach extended quite far. It claimed 7 lives in Travis County, 8 in Kendall County, 5 in Burnett County, 3 in Williamson County, and 1 life lost in Tom Green County.
So it really spread across the region.
It paints a vivid picture of the sheer, overwhelming force of this water event. It affected multiple communities, large and small.
And the descriptions of the scene, the physical aftermath, sounds just as harrowing.
Oh, absolutely. The landscape itself just screams destruction. Searchers, emergency responders, volunteers, they're still meticulously sifting through immense amounts of debris. Twisted metal, splintered wood, fragmented personal belongings.
That's everything torn apart.
Everything. They're navigating down trees that used to stand tall, wading through this thick black mud that covers everything like a suffocating shroud.
But a blanket of sludge.
Exactly. And the scenes described by those on the ground are heartbreakingly vivid. Finding little girl suitcases still packed with clothes, plush toys, now just caked and heavy with detritus and mud.
Oh, that's tough to hear.
These aren't just objects, you know? They are poignant, tangible reminders of the lives that were suddenly, violently, and, as we'll discuss, without effective warning, swept away. Each item tells a silent story of what was lost.
Underscoring the deep human cost of such rapid inundation. And when we talk about the speed, I mean, the term flash flood feels almost inadequate here, doesn't it?
It really does. The rapid inundation in Kerr County was, well, astonishing. A real display of nature's raw power. Consider the Guadalupe River in Kerrville.
Okay.
It surged from just 1 foot, to over 34 feet between 2 a.m. and 7 a.m. on that Friday morning.
33 feet in 5 hours in the middle of the night.
And get this, one report cited an incredible, almost unbelievable rise of 26 feet in just 45 minutes at one point.
26 feet in under an hour. That's not a rising river. That's a wall of water.
Exactly. A terrifying sudden wall engulfing everything. It makes you wonder what warnings, if any, were in place. And how were they communicated given that impossible speed? What chance did people really have?
Right. So were there warnings? Did the system work at all?
The initial warnings were in fact issued. The system was trying to do its job. The National Weather Service had put out a flash flood watch for the region on Thursday afternoon, July 3rd. That's sort of the preliminary heads up.
Okay, a watch.
They then, as the situation rapidly escalated into the very early hours of Friday, July 4th, a flash flood warning with a considerable tag was issued specifically for Bandera and Kerr counties at 1:14 a.m.
1:14 a.m. And that considerable tag is important, right? Doesn't that trigger phone alerts?
Yes, exactly. That specific type of warning is designed to automatically trigger wireless emergency alerts, or WEAs, to cell phones in the affected areas. They're meant to blare loudly, hopefully wake people up with that distinctive, attention-grabbing tone.
So theoretically, phones should have been going off around 1:15 a.m., but clearly the situation got even worse.
Much worse, and quickly. By 4:04 a.m. Friday, just under 3 hours later, a flash flood emergency was issued. That signifies an even graver, more immediate threat.
Emergency, that's the highest level, isn't it?
Pretty much. And it was followed just 19 minutes later by an even more urgent, particularly dangerous situation alert at 4:23 a.m.
Wow. So the alerts were escalating rapidly. Watch, warning, emergency, PDS, all in the dead of night.
The warnings from authorities were clearly intensifying, indicating a severe threat demanding immediate attention.
The critical question then becomes, how were these increasingly dire warnings actually received, or perhaps tragically not received, by people, especially when most were asleep?
And that's precisely where the perception and the grim reality of these alerts diverge so significantly. It reveals critical vulnerabilities.
Like what? Did people just sleep through them?
Well, some did. For instance, residents like Sue J. Martin. She did get phone alerts around 2 a.m., but she reportedly went back to sleep.
Why? I mean, a blaring alert at 2 a.m.
It's not uncommon, sadly. It's a psychological phenomenon. People in areas like the Hill Country, they get frequent, but often less severe, flood warnings. They can become desensitized.
Ah, the cry wolf effect.
Exactly. If warnings become routine, without dire consequences happen every time, the perceived urgency diminishes. So when a truly life-threatening event occurs, the alarm might not be taken seriously enough, or it's dismissed as, just another warning.
That's a dangerous complacency.
It's a really delicate balance for emergency managers.
Yeah.
How to warn effectively without causing this warning fatigue.
Makes sense. The brain tries to filter out perceived non-threats. But it sounds like for others, the issue wasn't desensitization, but the warnings never even reached them.
Precisely. An even more fundamental breakdown. Louis Kuckerick, for example, he recounted that he never received an official government text alert at all. Zero.
None. How did he find out?
He relied instead on a private service called Coda Red. It's a common community notification system, sends alerts via calls, texts, emails to subscribers.
Okay, Coda Red. Did that work?
For him, that alert arrived too late. By the time it came, the power was already out, roads were impassable, the notification was useless.
Power out, roads closed.
Yeah, too late. And Linda Clanton, a retired school teacher, she said she was only woken by a desperate call from her sister at 8:30 a.m. that morning, hours after the most critical warnings had gone out.
8:30. That highlights huge gaps in communication, doesn't it? Especially when warnings go out in the middle of the night or infrastructure fails.
Profound and dangerous gaps.
What other factors made communication so difficult? I mean, the Hill Country has its own challenges, right? Terrain, cell service.
That's crucial to understand here. It's this complex intersection of technology, human behavior, and the specific geographic and infrastructural challenges of rural areas, like the hill country.
Okay.
Wireless emergency alerts, WEAs, they're designed to blare loudly, sure. But they only work if your phone is on, charged, and critically, if you're in an area with reliable cell service.
Right. Three big ifs.
Big ifs. Many were asleep, phones silent or on Do Not Disturb, and a profound point often overlooked. Many children at summer camps and their counselors often didn't have cell phones at all.
Oh, right. The camps. Unplugged environments.
Exactly. Creates a massive, often invisible blind spot in the warning system, especially in a region packed with summer camps and outdoor activities.
And the cell service itself.
Yeah, in rural landscapes like the hill country, spotty cell service and limited communication towers are persistent, well-known problems. It makes broad, reliable dissemination of digital alerts incredibly difficult.
The hills and trees probably don't help either.
Definitely not. The physical terrain itself, rolling hills, deep valleys, dense tree cover, can significantly interfere with signal transmission, creates natural communication dead zones where even a working phone might not get a timely alert.
So a digital warning system, no matter how sophisticated, just runs into fundamental barriers in these kinds of places.
It really does.
Which makes you think about other ways to warn people, maybe older methods. Which brings us to this stark contrast we saw between Kerr County and a nearby town, Comfort.
It is indeed a stark contrast. Just 20 miles away, in Comfort, it's a town of about 2,300 people in Kendall County. They had a very different experience during this same flood.
Okay, Comfort. What happened there?
Their success offers a powerful, tangible lesson in preparedness. Stands right in contrast to Kerr County's tragedy.
What did they do differently? What made their experience so tragically different?
Comfort had recently, and crucially, updated their disaster alert system. This wasn't just a minor tweak, it was a strategic upgrade.
What kind of upgrade?
They installed a brand new siren at the volunteer fire department headquarters, and very intelligently, they moved an older siren to a low-lying, highly flood-prone area right along Cypress Creek.
Sirens, actual physical sirens.
Yes. And during this flood, for the very first time outside of routine tests, this new two-siren system was activated.
Yeah, the result.
Danny Morales, the assistant chief of the Comfort Volunteer Fire Department, reported a stark and incredibly positive outcome. 0 deaths in Comfort.
0 deaths. Wow. When did their sirens go off?
They sounded at 10:52 a.m.
Mid-morning, not the middle of the night.
Right. A time by which many residents were already awake, much more receptive to the warnings. The critical insight here isn't just that sirens save lives, though clearly they can, but that the will to prioritize and fund them, despite costs or inconveniences, is the real key. Comfort made that choice.
That's compelling. Timing helped, that the infrastructure was there. And their system isn't fully automated, is it? There's a human element.
That's a key detail. It speaks to local understanding. While Comfort's system is linked to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, via satellite dish, the local officials actually trigger the sirens manually when water levels rise past a certain point they've determined.
So local control.
Exactly. This human element in activation is crucial. It allows for local discretion. They know their terrain, their conditions. They can act on real-time observations, not just automated thresholds that might miss the nuance of a flash flood in their specific environment.
That makes a lot of sense. Combining tech with local expertise. Powerful. But then we look back at Kerr County, the devastation. And starkly, no similar siren system, despite years of talk about it.
No, none. And this wasn't a new idea that came too late. The discussions about a flood warning system in Kerr County go back almost a decade.
A decade?
Yes. Detailed conversations, for instance, took place way back in 2016. That was right after those really destructive floods in Hayes County in 2015 that tragically killed 13 people.
So they knew the risk. They saw what happened nearby.
Absolutely. Former Kerr County Commissioner Tom Moser, for example, had actively looked into implementing such a system then. The groundwork for discussion was there. The lessons were considered. This wasn't ignorance. It was about choices made despite knowing the risks.
So the need was identified, the conversation ongoing, a nearby tragedy as a warning. Who was arguing for the sirens? Why did they think they were so vital?
Former Kerr County Sheriff Rusty Heyerholzer was one of the most vocal advocates. He was adamant about the need for sirens, and crucially, in addition to phone systems like Code Red, not instead of them.
A layered approach.
Exactly. He said, and I'm quoting him directly, "You need the sirens, and you need Code Red to try and make sure we'll notify everybody as we can when it's coming up."
Okay.
His point was clear. Sirens provide redundancy, A distinct auditory warning, especially when digital alerts might fail middle of the night, no cell phones at camps, bad service. A necessary complement.
Makes sense, a multifaceted approach. Yet, despite those strong arguments, the sirens were never installed. Why? What were the reasons for rejection? It sounds complicated.
You're absolutely right. It was multifaceted, driven by various concerns and priorities. It really shows how complex these public policy decisions get. The most common reason cited, predictably, cost.
How much?
An estimated $1 million for a comprehensive system, sensors and sirens included. That was considered too expensive for Kerr County, which has an annual budget around $67 million.
$1 million out of $67 million.
Kerr County Judge Rob Kelly explicitly said taxpayers won't pay for it. That statement highlights a key psychological thing we'll talk about later, the framing effect.
How so?
If you frame it not as a vital safety investment, a relatively small fraction of the budget, but as an excessive burden on taxpayers, it's a much harder sell, especially in a fiscally conservative area. An extra expense versus a life-saving necessity.
So, the financial hurdle was presented as insurmountable. Did they try to get outside money? Grants?
Yes, attempts were made, but they failed. The county put in a bid for a $1 million Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, grant. They could have fully funded it, but they lost
Very
out.
lucky.
And former Commissioner Moser also noted that, at the time, no other timely grants seemed available. Plus, the Upper Guadalupe River Authority looked into applying to the state's Flood Infrastructure Fund, a fund specifically for this stuff, but they dropped the idea.
Why drop it?
Because it would only provide about 5% of the needed money, just not enough to make a dent. It shows a critical problem. Even when need is identified, grant funding can be piecemeal, leaving communities stuck. It's systemic.
So cost and funding failures were big parts of it, but were there other objections, maybe less tangible ones? Resistance to the idea itself.
Absolutely. There was this perception of this system as, well, an extravagance, an unnecessary imposition. Then Commissioner H.A. Buster Baldwin openly questioned its necessity. He famously called it a little extravagant for Kerr County with sirens and such.
Extravagant. That's a strong word for a safety system.
It is. It goes beyond just cost, touches on maybe relatability. If officials or influential people didn't personally feel the immediate, dire need, maybe never experienced a bad flood themselves, saw it as rare, then $1 million for an occasional noisy siren could easily seem extravagant.
And didn't Baldwin also vote against even studying it?
He did. He voted against a $50,000 engineering study that would have detailed the feasibility and actual costs. That signals a pre-existing skepticism about the whole idea, not just a data-driven objection.
So a feeling it was too much for the area. What about practical concerns? False alarms, noise?
Yes, very much so. That was a common concern voiced, the potential for false alarms. Some residents and officials just disliked the idea because sirens could go off accidentally, causing, as they termed it, disturbance in the hill country.
Disturbance.
While it seems minor compared to safety, it touches on maybe cultural values, that strong preference for peace and quiet in a rural setting. For some, that tranquility might, paradoxically, outweigh the perceived need for a loud, startling warning system, an intrusion.
The desire for quiet contributing to a lack of safety measures.
Wow. What about effectiveness? Did people think they'd even work in the hill country terrain?
There was skepticism there, too. Rep. Wes Verdell and others questioned if sirens would be effective for people indoors or spread out across hills and dense trees where sound might not carry well.
Okay, a legitimate physical concern.
And they also raised the issue of spotty cell service, sort of arguing that if cell service was already bad, maybe sirens wouldn't reach everyone either, making them a poor investment.
That logic seems a bit circular. It can seem that way. It also speaks maybe to information overload and confirmation bias. If you're already skeptical about warning systems, maybe due to phone alert fatigue or cost, any new solution like sirens can be viewed through a lens of potential failure. It's easier to find reasons why something won't work if that aligns with your preference to avoid the cost or perceived disturbance.
So a real perfect storm of obstacles, cost, grant failures, feeling it was extravagant, worries about noise and false alarms, doubts about effectiveness. It's a lot.
A lot of reasons piled up to prevent action.
And it wasn't just the lack of sirens. The other methods, like the cell alerts, they had their own distinct challenges too, didn't they?
That's crucial. While wireless emergency alerts, WEAs, were technically issued, they went out when most people were fast asleep. Limited impact. An alert's effectiveness depends on someone being awake and aware to act immediately.
Right, and the kids at camp?
Can't stress that enough. Many children in summer camps, their counselors, totally without cell phones. An unplugged environment means a total blind spot for digital warnings.
A huge, tragic blind spot.
Beyond that, the fundamental issue. Rural areas with bad cell service, limited towers. Even if phones were on, alerts might not arrive reliably or quickly. And finally, as Kerrville City Manager Dalton Rice noted, that desensitization to frequent phone alerts, people just tune them out. Dangerous complacency.
It really is a confluence of tech, behavior, geography,
Yeah.
and political decisions. So what about now? After this horror, are local officials changing their tune? Or sticking to the old rationales?
There's a palpable shift, a clear sense of reflection. The tragedy has undeniably forced a painful reevaluation for many.
Like who?
Kerr County Judge Rob Kelly, who initially said, "We didn't know this flood was coming," and noted the lack of a river warning system, he's now facing immense pressure and seems open to reconsidering.
Okay.
Kerrville City Manager Dalton Rice, who talked about that delicate balance in evacuations too late, puts people on flooded roads. But flash floods are so fast, he's now talking about a comprehensive reevaluation of all warning systems.
A full review.
And a particularly telling example, City of Ingram Council member Raymond Howard. He admitted he initially ignored 3 flash flood warnings himself.
Wow. 3 warnings ignored.
But now, he plans to advocate passionately for warning sirens in his community. This immediate, painful experience, it's been a brutal, undeniable lesson. It shows that openness to change driven by direct, undeniable evidence. When the devil you know, no sirens, just phone alerts proves devastating, the unfamiliar solution suddenly looks necessary.
That's a profound turnaround for someone who ignored the warnings. Lived experience, shifting perspectives. And it's not just local folks, right? Even at the state level, there's rethinking.
Precisely. State Rep Wes Verdell, who actually voted against a bill meant to improve disaster warning systems statewide.
He voted against it.
Yes, but now he explicitly states, in hindsight, watching what it takes to deal with a disaster like this, my vote would probably be different now.
Hindsight is 20/20, tragically.
It shows how personal observation of tragedy can cut through established political stances. Kerrville's city manager Rice confirmed they definitely want to dive in and look at all those things, from cell service tower to radio communications or emergency alerting, once search and rescue ends. A comprehensive review is planned.
Good.
And significantly, Governor Greg Abbott has also left the door open to future legislation on emergency warning systems, acknowledging the urgent need for reassessment at the highest state levels.
So maybe finally, the political will might be there.
Sometimes, sadly, only the stark reality of tragedy can overcome that ingrained resistance to change, cost aversion, or political inertia against big safety investments. It forces a reevaluation of priorities.
Which brings us to the broader legislative debates. If officials are now open to revisiting this, what happened before? Why did bills fail? Let's look at the state capitol, the wider political landscape.
This is where we see those broader patterns of decision-making, influenced by powerful political motivations, fiscal priorities. A key piece of legislation, House Bill 13, HB 13, was designed to address precisely these kinds of issues statewide.
HB 13, what was it supposed to do?
Authored by Rep. Ken King, a Republican from Canadian, it proposed creating a new government council to set up a statewide emergency response plan. Crucially, it would also manage a grant program for counties across Texas.
Grants for what?
For buying essential emergency communication equipment, building infrastructure like radio towers, and yes, outdoor warning sirens and new alert systems. A direct attempt to provide the tools communities like Kerr County lacked.
Sounds exactly like what was needed. Proactive, comprehensive. Where did the idea come from?
Directly from last year's devastating wildfires in the Texas Panhandle. Over 1 million acres burned, 3 people died. The intent at HB 13 was clear. Learn from that. Prevent similar tragedies statewide by improving communication and warnings. For fires, floods, any disaster.
Makes sense. Learn from one disaster to prevent the next, but it failed.
It failed to pass in the Texas Senate. Never made it into law.
Why not? What were the arguments against it? It seems so necessary.
The primary argument, as often happens, was cost. The initial price tag was $500 million. That drew heavy criticism right away.
$500 million. That's a big number.
It is. State Rep. Tony Tinderholt, a Republican from Arlington, called it $500 million and suggested voting against it should be one of the most simple votes we should be able to take today, implying it was an easy no because of the cost.
Again, that framing effect. $500 million sounds huge, maybe irresponsible rather than a long-term safety investment.
Exactly. Emphasis squarely on the cost, not the potential benefits, lives saved, property protected.
Were there other objections besides the sticker shock? Practical concerns?
Yes, concerns about timeliness and relevance, especially given how fast technology changes. Stephen Arani, a spokesperson for Elteen Governor Dan Patrick, argued the bill's proposed 10-year rollout for local grant money meant systems would be outdated due to advances in technology before they were even fully implemented.
The obsolescence argument.
Right. The idea was, why invest in something that might be outdated soon? He also claimed the grants were limited to planning purposes only. They did not support disaster response directly, implying a disconnect from immediate needs.
Is that accurate? Planning grants don't help response.
Well, planning is the first step to effective response in infrastructure. But the argument taps into that bias if you're already against a big spend. Focusing on future obsolescence or lack of immediate response capability helps justify the opposition. It's easier to dismiss a long-term plan by highlighting potential future flaws rather than the current, tangible need for any improvement.
Did Irani suggest other areas were funded instead, as an alternative justification?
He did. He emphasized that lawmakers, including the Senate, had made unprecedented investments in other disaster response areas that session, totaling $547 million.
Like what?
He listed things like $257 million for disaster response aircraft, $135 million for regional operation facilities, $90 million for rural ambulances, $65 million for emergency response drone technology.
So helicopters, buildings, ambulances, drones, more tangible response tools.
Exactly. The argument was, while HB 13 focused on warning infrastructure, these more direct response tools were being prioritized. It illustrates a key point. There's often a political preference for funding visible, immediate disaster response capabilities over less visible, proactive prevention and warning infrastructure.
Even if prevention could save more lives and money long term.
Potentially, yes.
Mm-hmm.
But response tools are tangible, politicians can point to them. Easier to justify to voters than a complex warning system that ideally you hope you don't have to use often.
So a focus on reacting rather than preventing. This connects to the bigger picture, right?
Yes.
The overall state of flood management funding in Texas.
Absolutely. Zoom out, and Texas faces an immense, growing backlog of needed flood management projects statewide. Estimated cost,
Yeah.
a staggering $54 billion.
$54 billion.
Billion, with a B. It speaks to decades of underinvestment. The state flood plan from the Texas Water Development Board explicitly called for substantial extra funding. But so far, lawmakers have allocated only about $669 million through the state's Flood Infrastructure Fund.
Less than $700 million allocated for a $54 billion known need. That's a huge disparity.
It is, and this kind of fiscal decision often ties back to things like partisan loyalty or identity politics. Funding infrastructure might be less immediately appealing to a party's base than other priorities like tax cuts or certain social policies, even if the long-term safety benefit is huge.
And speaking of tax cuts, didn't Texas lawmakers do something big on that front recently?
They did. This relatively tiny allocation for critical flood infrastructure happened in the same legislative environment where lawmakers approved a colossal $51 billion in property tax cuts this year.
$51 billion in tax cuts versus less than $1 billion for a $54 billion flood infrastructure need.
It highlights a very stark prioritization. It's a deliberate choice about where resources are deemed most urgently needed, or perhaps where they're most politically expedient to win voter support.
Tax cuts are popular, visible, immediate. Infrastructure is long-term, less visible until it fails.
Precisely. Broad, popular measures like tax cuts often win out over those less visible long-term investments, even when those investments directly impact public safety and resilience against disasters that are clearly getting worse.
So the path to better warnings and flood protection seems blocked by money and politics. But after these floods, is there new momentum? Are things changing?
There certainly appears to be renewed urgency, at least for now. Senator Paul Bettencourt publicly stated he plans to file a new bill as soon as possible to reinstate civil defense sirens, specifically targeting flood-prone river valleys.
A direct response. Seems like it. And Governor Abbott confirmed the Republican-controlled Texas legislature will investigate the floods and discuss prevention during a special session later this month. So while past efforts failed, this tragedy has undeniably pushed the issue back onto the agenda. The human cost might finally be the catalyst for that openness to change.
Let's hope so. Now, widening the lens even further, beyond Texas to federal agencies' forecasting capacity, this disaster has ignited a national debate, hasn't it, about funding, effectiveness, and some specific political connections.
That's right. This tragedy brought renewed, intense scrutiny to federal spending on weather forecasting and disaster preparedness nationwide. And at the center of this discussion is legislation known broadly as President Donald Trump's Big Beautiful Bill.
The Big Beautiful Bill, what was that?
A wide-ranging piece of legislation, passed very narrowly. 51-50 in the Senate, with Vice President J.D. Vance casting the tie-breaking vote, and 218-214 in the House. Very politically contentious.
And what's its relevance to weather in these floods? Why is it being discussed now? Because a specific language included in it that removed significant funding from critical federal weather agencies. Specifically, Texas Senator Ted Cruz signed language into the bill removing $150 million intended for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and the National Weather Service, the NWS.
$150 million cut from NOAA and NWS. What was that money for?
Explicitly earmarked to accelerate advances and improvements in research, observation systems, modeling, forecasting, assessments, and dissemination of information to the public. Basically making forecasts and warnings better.
Okay. Any other related cuts?
Yes. A separate $50 million for grants to study climate impact on oceans, weather, and coastal ecosystems was also removed. So a combined $200 million in cuts to programs directly aimed at improving forecasting, observation, and public alerts.
Wow. $200 million. That's the point of contention, whether cuts like these undermine our ability to get timely warnings.
Precisely.
But just to be clear, these specific cuts hadn't actually taken effect yet, right? They didn't directly impact the forecasting for this flood.
That is correct. Crucial point. The cuts hadn't been implemented yet, so they didn't directly influence these events in Texas. They weren't the cause of any warning failure in this instance.
Okay.
However, the mere existence of these planned cuts and the debate around them has definitely spurred a renewed, intense discussion of the overall funding, capacity, and future readiness of these vital federal services. It raises the question, would cuts like these diminish future capabilities for similar extreme events, which seem to be happening more often?
Fair question. And the voting record on this bill, it's specific and under scrutiny now. Who supported it, especially from Texas?
Certainly. In the Senate, 50 Republican senators voted yes, plus VP Vance breaking the tie. That included both Texas senators, Ted Cruz and John Cornyn.
Okay, Cruz and Cornyn. And the House.
In the House, 218 Republican representatives voted for it. From the Texas delegation, it's quite a list. Jody C. Arrington, Brian Babin, John Carter, Michael Cloud, Dan Crenshaw, Monica De La Cruz, Beth Van Dyne, Pat Fallon, Brandon Gill, Craig Goldman, Tony Gonzalez, Lance Gooden, Wesley Hunt, Ronnie Jackson, John James, Morgan Luttrell, Michael McCall, Nathaniel Moran, Troy Nels, August Pfluger, Chip Roy, Keith Self, Pete Sessions, Randy Weber, and Roger Williams.
That's a lot of Texas representatives.
It shows broad support within that party delegation for the bill and its provisions, including those NOAA and WS cuts. Understanding this is key to seeing the national legislative landscape affecting weather preparedness and how deeply partisan loyalty can shape decisions with major public safety implications.
Understood. Now, shifting to the immediate debate, the effectiveness of the warnings for this flood, some Texas officials were critical of the National Weather Service forecast, weren't they?
Yes, that was a significant point of contention right after. Emergency Management Chief W. Nimkid, for instance, stated publicly that the original NWS forecast predicted 3 to 6 inches in one area, 4 to 8 inches in the hill country. But he added pointedly, the amount of rain that fell in this specific location was never in any of those forecasts.
Implying they underestimated it badly.
That was the implication. Kerrville City Manager Dalton Rice echoed that, saying the storm dumped more rain than what was forecast. The suggestion from these local officials is that NWS underestimated the severity and localization impacting their preparedness and warning decisions.
So local officials pointing fingers at the NWS forecasts. How did the NWS and the broader weather community respond?
There's been a strong defense. Many independent meteorologists and a former NWS official stated the agency performed as well as it possibly could, given how notoriously difficult flash floods are to predict precisely.
They are very localized and rapid, right?
Incredibly. Pinpointing exact rainfall totals in tiny areas is hugely challenging, even with the best models. The NWS itself put out a statement saying flash flood warnings were issued with preliminary lead times of more than 3 hours before warning criteria were met, which is considered substantial for such rapid events.
3 hours lead time is pretty good for a flash flood.
Generally, yes. And White House spokesperson Abigail Jackson also weighed in, stating that false claims about the NWS have been repeatedly debunked. The counter-argument is basically forecasts aren't perfect, especially for these extreme localized events. But the NWS gave timely, escalating warnings based on the best available science. It highlights scientific limits, not necessarily agency failure.
It clearly became political very fast. Different sides blaming different things, the Weather Service, legislative decisions. How did key political figures frame this, especially regarding those funding cuts?
Immediately polarized. Republican Senator Ted Cruz quickly dismissed talk about the NOAA NWS cuts as partisan finger-pointing. He suggested opponents were exploiting the tragedy.
Okay, how did he justify that?
He argued the National Weather Service Union itself had publicly said staff reductions had no impact whatsoever on their ability to warn about this event. He called for a review, but warned against using the crisis to attack political opponents. Classic deflection, framing it as political opportunism, making the funding cuts off limits for criticism.
And President Trump, how did he characterize it, given his administration's role in the funding decisions?
When asked about rehiring meteorologists after the flood, President Trump said he would think not. He characterized the event saying, "It happened in seconds, nobody expected it, nobody saw it, once in 100 years.
So framing it as an unforeseeable anomaly.
Exactly, implying no amount of forecasting investment could have prevented it, minimizing the role of preparedness and prediction. That once in 100 years framing serves to deflect responsibility from policy decisions by making it seem like a freak event.
But obviously not everyone agreed with that assessment.
Not at all. Democratic Texas Representative Joaquin Castro took a different view. He said a full investigation should determine if previous job cuts played any role in NWS capacity. He emphasized, "I don't think it's helpful to have missing key personnel from the National Weather Service not in place to help prevent these tragedies," directly challenging the idea staffing is irrelevant.
And there was sharper criticism, too, specifically about Senator Cruz's role in those cuts.
Yes. Cassidy DePaola, who writes the Fossil Free Memo newsletter on Substack, stated very directly that Senator Ted Cruz, quote, helped pass the so-called Big Beautiful Bill, a sweeping fossil fuel giveaway that also slashed $200 million from NOAA's weather forecasting and public alert programs. The money was meant to improve early warnings for exactly the kind of fast-moving, deadly flooding that just hit his own state.
Wow. And she specified his role.
She did. She added. The cuts weren't in the House version. Cruz added them in the Senate, behind closed doors, as chair of the committee that oversees NOAA. This perspective directly links specific legislative actions and the alleged motivations behind them to the impact on public safety, highlights the deep political dimensions of these funding decisions.
This whole intense debate over funding, warnings, responsibility, it really brings us to a crucial point. Understanding why these decisions get made, locally, statewide, nationally.
Exactly.
We've seen how costs, politics, perceptions can block safety measures, how lack of preparedness leads to tragedy. But to really grasp it, we need to look beyond policy debates into something more fundamental: the complex human psychology behind voter and political decision-making.
That's such a critical lens. It's essential to acknowledge political and public choices aren't always purely rational. They're driven by this incredibly complex mix of incentives, deep feelings, subjective interpretations of reality. Everyone brings their own outlook, their own experiences.
Which often leads to outcomes that might seem illogical from the outside, right?
Absolutely. Counterintuitive sometimes.
Yeah.
So this final section is about providing a framework for understanding those public and political choices. How these deep motivations shape our vulnerability or our resilience to events like these floods. Peeling back the layers of human motivation behind every decision or non-decision.
Okay. So let's unpack some of these key motivations influencing voting and, by extension, decisions about community safety. First up, a really powerful one: partisan loyalty. How does that play into rejecting sirens or debating Weather Service funding?
Partisan loyalty is huge, almost gravitational. For many people, being a Democrat or Republican isn't just preference, it's part of their identity, built over decades. Shared values, memories, rallies, even merchandise.
Yeah.
Strong social bonds form around the party.
So it's deep.
Very. So if their party or representative makes a decision that seems off, like voting against warning systems like HB 13, or for cuts like those in the Big Beautiful Bill, they might still feel an overwhelming urge to support it or rationalize it, just to keep their party in power or show loyalty.
Even if it goes against their own ideals.
Sometimes, yes. They might suppress or ignore their own ideals to justify it, often reinforced by consuming media that favors their party and slams the opposition, creates powerful echo chambers, makes it hard to critically evaluate decisions, even ones affecting safety, like neglecting flood infrastructure. Party power can override policy specifics.
Identity and belonging trumping policy. Makes sense. What about identity politics more broadly and ideologies? How do they shape things here?
Another incredibly strong motivator. Voters often gravitate to candidates they feel represent their specific identity, race, gender, orientation, socioeconomic status. When parties champion these identities, people feel a stronger emotional connection, deep allegiance.
Feeling represented matters.
Hugely. Plus, people are motivated by policies promising better circumstances for their social in-groups, especially if they feel their group is marginalized or ignored by the other side.
So how does that connect to flood safety?
Well, for example, if a party champions tax cuts and reduced government spending in ideology appealing to a certain identity group, voters might prioritize supporting that party, even if it means less funding for collective infrastructure like flood control or emergency services. The ideology itself limited government. Fiscal conservatism can become an identity, leading to decisions consistent with that framework, even if not directly focused on flood risk at that moment.
And how information is presented, the framing, that must be massive.
Paramount. The framing effect is all about the subtle but powerful tone, phrasing, filters used to communicate ideas, policies, events. It significantly influences perception.
Like the Kerr County sirens.
Perfect example. Framed positively, lives saved, resilience, minimal cost per resident, it might get support. Framed negatively, extravagant, burden on taxpayers, disturbance, like Commissioner Baldwin did, it's a much harder sell.
Or the big beautiful bill cuts.
Right. Critics frame it as slashing vital services. Proponents frame it as responsible fiscal management, or prioritizing other more effective tools like Irani did. Very different realities for the voter. Campaigns carefully frame things like patriotism, too, making opponents seem less patriotic, influencing how voters see issues, even safety ones. Language shapes reality.
Not just what is said, but how. And the emotional resonance. What about social circles? Group influence, especially in tight communities.
Social influence is pivotal, creates powerful dynamics that can override individual logic, even self-preservation. People look to friends, family, colleagues, online groups for guidance, reinforcement.
Leads to groupthink.
Easily. The desire for harmony, acceptance, loyalty within the group causes individuals to make decisions contradicting their personal logic. Suppressing dissent, prioritizing consensus over critical analysis. That's how echo chambers form, reinforcing biases, reducing exposure to alternatives.
So someone might see the value in sirens but stay quiet if the group dismisses them.
Exactly. To maintain social cohesion, avoid being an outlier. Emotional bonds amplify this, makes it incredibly hard to break ranks, even with compelling evidence of a threat, like a flood next door.
And today we're drowning in information and misinformation. How does that overload affect voters trying to grasp complex issues like disaster preparedness?
Information overload is a massive challenge. Fundamentally alters engagement. The average voter is bombarded. Social media, TV ads, reports, podcasts, forums, conflicting headlines, so much information, so much disinformation.
It's overwhelming.
Totally. Trying to sift through it logically, determine credibility, synthesize it into a justifiable choice. It's too much for most people. Leads to mental shortcuts, relying on trusted, maybe biased sources, or just disengagement.
Meaning simple messages cut through.
Exactly. A well-funded, repeated soundbite, even if inaccurate, like extravagant or obsolete, cuts through the noise more effectively than a nuanced, evidence-based argument for complex solutions like flood infrastructure. People tune out when overwhelmed, leaving them vulnerable to simplified narratives.
Does education level play a role in navigating this? Does it correlate with how people assess policies or candidates?
Research suggests it does, yes. Studies indicate more educated voters are more likely to align their candidate choice with their broader ideologies, seeing the bigger picture, interconnected issues like disaster prep and funding.
And less educated voters?
According to research, like from political science professor Diogo Ferrari, they're more likely to focus intensely on a single appealing policy from a candidate, say, property tax cuts.
Right.
While perhaps overlooking or giving less weight to other policies that might not be in their overall best interest long-term, like the impact of those cuts on funding for flood control.
Not about intelligence, but how complex policy interactions are processed when overwhelmed.
Precisely, a difference in focus and prioritization.
And for many, cultural or religious values are core. How do those factor in, potentially overriding things like safety measures?
They're foundational, incredibly powerful drivers. If a party promotes policies contradicting cherished religious or cultural norms, they'll likely lose that group's favor, regardless of other positions.
Conversely, aligning with those values wins support.
Very likely, yes. Even if the individual voter might prefer the competitor's other policies, maybe one's offering more direct safety benefits. For example, prioritizing a candidate's stance on social issues tied to faith over their stance on infrastructure spending.
And religious gatherings.
They create opportunities for influence by authoritative figures, imams, preachers voicing support for candidates or policies, reinforcing group cohesion. Conversely, some voters strongly believe in separation of church and state, voting for parties with fewer overt religious preferences. So even the presence or absence of religiosity is a factor.
Huge factor, potentially overriding pragmatic safety concerns. What about just relatability? Personal stories.
Crucial, often underestimated. When candidates share stories that resonate with voters' lives, struggles, aspirations, it creates a powerful emotional bond, often outweighs cold policy differences.
People prefer candidates who seem genuine, approachable.
Frequently, believing they understand their struggles because they've lived similar experiences. This emotional connection can lead people to support candidates who might not align perfectly on policy, maybe weak on flood control, but feels like one of us because they feel understood. More powerful than a policy brief sometimes.
Feeling seen. Finally, what about openness to change itself? Do we embrace new solutions when old ones fail, or stick with the familiar?
A profound challenge. There's a strong tendency to stick with familiar parties, policies, ways of doing things, perceived as safer, less risky.
Even if things aren't working.
Even then, voters might keep electing the same party or sticking with established practices, assuming the devil you know is better than the devil you don't. Often stems from self-preservation, avoiding unknown risks, not necessarily a desire for progress. It explains why a community like Kerr County might resist new siren tech for years, despite known risks.
And this ties into confirmation bias, right? Seeking out what we already believe.
Absolutely. When people research, they tend to seek info confirming their existing beliefs, dismissing contradictory evidence. If someone believes new infrastructure is too expensive, they'll gravitate to opinions reinforcing that, dismissing reports on siren effectiveness and comfort, or the long-term costs of flood damage.
Even open-minded people.
Even then, it's a conflict. We might inadvertently gravitate towards familiar narratives confirming biases. Floods don't happen here. We've always managed without sirens, supporting decisions or politicians who, in hindsight, aren't acting in the interest of safety, especially with worsening natural phenomena. A powerful psychological hurdle for proactive solutions.
As we bring this deep dive to a close, it's just so clear. Understanding something like the Texas Hill Country floods, it requires looking so much further than just the weather.
So much further.
It demands examining community preparedness, the legislative landscape hindering or helping safety infrastructure, federal support for forecasting, and crucially, that complex human psychology behind decisions at all levels. Local councils, federal lawmakers, every voter. It's not just about water, it's about human choice.
The lessons are profoundly difficult, but so important. They force us to confront this intricate web contributing to disaster. How our collective choices, large and small, conscious and unconscious, influence our vulnerability to phenomena that are only intensifying.
A stark reminder that resilience isn't just meteorology or engineering.
It's deeply about the social, political, psychological currents shaping our response to nature. A call to look inward at our own biases and motivations as much as outward at the forecasts.
That really frames the enduring question for all of us, doesn't it? In the face of intensifying nature, the painful lessons learned, how do we, as communities, as a society, foster greater collective foresight and responsiveness?
How do we bridge those gaps between immediate threats and long-term planning?
And how do we navigate the diverse, often conflicting motivations shaping our actions and inactions, especially when those actions mean life or death? It's a conversation that has to continue. Requires understanding the science, yes, but also ourselves and our collective will. We really hope this deep dive provided you with clearer understanding, maybe sparked some reflection.
Thank you for joining us for this crucial discussion. Your engagement in these complex topics is absolutely vital for building a more resilient future.
And thank you for listening to Meteorology Matters. Remember, staying informed is key. You can follow meteorologist Rob Jones on Instagram. He's meteorologist.
On TikTok, TV meteorologist.
And subscribe to the Rob Jones Hurricane YouTube channel. You'll find the full Meteorology Matters podcast playlist there too, filled with more insights and deep dives. We'll be back soon with another critical exploration.